So I recently joined a Facebook group where we can discuss the ideas of Professor Jordan Peterson, and I came across a question sort of formulated like an objection to something that he said during the infamous Bogged Down podcast with Sam Harris, where they debate the nature of what is true. And he writes, I agreed with 100% of what JP has been saying until I saw his disagreement with Sam Harris on the nature of truth. If I understand correctly, JP thinks we should change the definition of truth to, quote, truth that is useful, quote, question mark. I heard him say, quote, your definition of truth is different than mine, end quote, in a way that struck me as almost, quote, SJW logic. And then he asks comments for everyone else in the group. And I have a response to this. I also puzzled over that issue for a couple days and ended up writing out a lot of my thoughts to it. But I think that it made sense in the end, and I think that it only makes sense if you kind of attack the rationalist sort of Sam Harris version of truth. But you don't actually have to attack it. You might just want to describe it differently. So I think that there's really a distinction here between truth and validity that Peterson's getting at, but which he doesn't really articulate clearly. And that may be because he's kind of suffering the curse of knowledge, where a lot of things that seem clear to him, because he's been thinking about them for a very long time, aren't always clear to us, because he makes a simple statement: we don't have infinite knowledge, we're finite creatures. And that has a lot of implications. And one of those implications lines up with something that he says frequently elsewhere, which is that our knowledge is typically, maybe always, founded on other axioms that are unprovable, that are simply taken, you could say, on faith or by belief. I remember when I was in college, a professor of ours, after we had studied Kant for a semester, asked us to examine whether or not we thought Kant was simply another, quote, belief philosopher, whether he had proven something or everything that he had proven beyond, having any further questions about it, or whether there was any part of it that you needed to take simply as postulated upon which the rest was founded. And Peterson's very clear that he thinks this way, that we don't know what's at the bottom of existence. We don't know that upon which our knowledge rests. You could say we weren't designed to, we weren't evolved to, but what we do know can be internally consistent, and it can be useful. So, for instance, if I say that something is red, that's only true insofar as you speak English and you hear me use the sound red to refer to something, and you look at it, and you also use the same sound, so you'll agree, yes, that's red. But you can of course say to that, well, that's language. Of course language is kind of contrived, but strangely enough, it seems that even mathematics operates this way. I'm not a mathematician, but from my understanding of it, Gödel's incompleteness theorems state that a set of mathematical propositions can be true only if you don't follow them to all their possible corollaries, because if you let loose a set of mathematical propositions to all the corollaries that would result from them, you will eventually run into contradictions within your set. So a set can either be valid or it can be complete, but it can't be both. And that's a strange revelation, and it can affect the way you see the world. So it seems like a large part of the disagreement between Peterson and Harris in the podcast was about semantics, which is why it was kind of difficult to listen to after a certain point. I thought it was interesting, but you just found yourself thinking things you wanted to say to them to clarify something that was clearly not being bridged between them. Because when Peterson says we're finite creatures, we don't have infinite knowledge, he's saying that we only have conditional validity, and that's what we refer to as truth, because beyond that, there's an unknown universe of things. Basically, we can only make if-then statements. If you speak English, then when I point to this thing and call it red, then you will agree that it is red, and even in math. So it seems, anyway. So, when I posted this answer to the person, they seemed fairly satisfied, but said that this point about us being finite might breed intellectual complacency, because atheists usually have this issue with Christians, where they say, well, we're finite. A Christian might say, we're so limited, and we can't have absolute knowledge, so we might as well just, I guess, take the revelations and go with that, and not really search that much further, because we can't get to perfection anyway. But that's only taking one of Peterson's important points, and not the second one. Now, the first point, is that we're finite. We don't have absolute knowledge. But the second point is that something can be true enough to aid in our survival, true enough to help us move forward, move up, true enough to help aid in the survival of ourselves, our family, our group, or our whole civilization. And Peterson uses the phrase true enough very often in the discussion with Harris. And a lot of times when Harris says true enough, Peterson jumps on it and goes, that's right, true enough. And that's what's important to him. And since you're going for true enough, but then in the language of Professor Peterson, you'll sometimes fall into the underworld and face chaos. You'll be somewhere where what you already know doesn't suffice, and then you need to ask more questions to get through that chaos. You need to be very careful about what you say and think in that time, because you need to make sure that it's as truthful as it can be to make sense of this new nonsensical thing that you've been confronted with, or something that has jarred you out of what seemed to be a relatively complete interpretation of the world. So you had your life going decently well, and then, as he usually uses this example, you maybe find out that your spouse has been having an affair, or maybe you suddenly lose your job, and what you thought you knew to be secure is not. And at that time, what was true enough is no longer true enough. So you've got to ask more questions. And maybe you can anticipate that you'll be running into problems like this. So you don't want to really ever be complacent that what you have is true enough. So you kind of keep updating it, and you look out for potential issues. You plan for potential future encounters with chaos and potential future descents into the underworld. And I think that it's really cool to use Peterson's language here. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's found his imagery and his descriptions really helpful. So I don't think that it really causes a problem with intellectual complacency, because you've got to take that second point along with the first. Yes, you're finite, and you won't have absolute knowledge. No, it won't be perfect, but it can be good enough, and it can be true enough for a certain time, for a while, and then it won't be. So you've got to keep looking, and you've always got to keep looking. And that's pretty much my take on it all. And I hope this has been interesting, and I'll see you next time.